All right, and are you all seeing a lovely slide with what we're here for? Okay, great. So I think I recognize a number of you. I'm Mariah Casillas, she, her pronouns with Philanthropy Network, Greater Philadelphia. And I am very happy to have our speakers here today, to have all of you on this event to discuss this important report. So I'm going to turn it over to the speakers in a second to introduce themselves, but just wanted to, say a word right now. If you haven't had a chance to read the report, please, make time on your calendars afterward to really go through it in detail. It's a critical report, and the question of how can regional funders best support the needs of Black nonprofit leaders and Black serving organizations is, one we often hear from our members, but we know the efforts are lagging behind the desire for a number of reasons. So, this is a timely question, but one that needs to live in all of our work well beyond the kind of lifespan of this report. So, that's why I'm just saying I'm really happy everyone's here, and hope that, as you listen through, it's not only how can we as regional philanthropy support these leaders, but how can you? And so I hope you listen for that throughout this presentation. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Kelly Woodland, who is the newly appointed Managing Director, Leadership Equity at United Way of Greater Philadelphia and Southern New Jersey. And yes, I needed to read that to make sure I got all right, but hopefully thanks, Kelly.
All right, good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mariah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll hold off my introductions until I do my part, but I would like to introduce my partners in this effort, David Brown and Charmaine Matlock-Turner. David, would you like to introduce yourself? Dave, you want to take yourself off mute if you
How about that? And I tell people not to do that all the time. So let me start again. I'm David Brown, so proud to be part of this effort, particularly the time in which we do it and the time in which we find these findings moving forward. In my official capacity is I'm the diversity advisor to the Office of the Dean of Klein College of Media and Communications at Temple University. I'm also a pastor, so I bring that faith view to this, and also part of my role has been helping to tell the story out to the broader media as part of the work that I do as a public relations practitioner. And a longtime friend, colleague of both Kelly and Charmaine. So whatever they say do, I do.
All right, Charmaine.
Hi, Charmaine Matlock-Turner. I'm the CEO of the Urban Affairs Coalition. I have the distinction of being the first woman to lead the organization, and it's really been a terrific culmination of a career that has spanned working in electoral politics, working in the legislative branches, both in the city and in Harrisburg, but most importantly, really falling in love with nonprofits and community-based nonprofits, and to get like the best job. Luckily, David Brown was on the board and helped to make sure that they chose me. And it absolutely has been a tremendous, wonderful time for me to really see what I say, the real work, how the real work gets done. The real work gets done on the ground by people who care about their neighbors and their families and their city and the world. So it's great to be here, and excited to talk about our work that we've been doing over the last, I guess now it's almost 10 years, Kelly and David.
Exactly. Okay, David, you want to kick us off by going through the PowerPoint, and then you'll turn it to me and I'll dig into the findings, give a little bit of context, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, absolutely. So I'm not driving the presentations. Whoever has the controls on the PowerPoint, let's go to the next slide.
All right, that'll be me. So just
okay, thank you so much, Mariah. I appreciate it. So really, let me just give quickly a background. The branch Associates report back in 2016, the Philadelphia African American Leadership Forum was an initiative that was started some time ago. Kelly was part of that, as was Charmaine, looking at how the work that's done as it relates to Black nonprofits, or the Urban Affairs Coalition as in was then, provided the project oversight. And I should also mention the fact that one of the things that was so key for us was that, even though the United Way funded the study, it was very important for us to utilize, identify, and find an African-American focused research entity, and also to invest in that research. So that research was fairly extensive. 145 nonprofit executives were polled. Focus groups were then also held with Black leaders and interviews with regional funders. And we created the report of Philadelphia's nonprofit human service organization, how African-American-led organizations differ from white-led organizations. I will say, as a quick aside, Kelly also played a significant role in actually getting the kind of responses that we needed, but Charmaine was really critical too in making sure that we had a rigorous approach to our research, because we knew that it needed to withstand the scrutiny of anybody who's going to look at this to make sure that it needed to have what it did as it relates to the findings. Let's move to the next slide, please. Thank you, Mariah. So what did we find? So we know that there were significant challenges with fundraising by Black-led organizations in comparison to their white counterparts. There was still, and there was, and still is, board diversity and entitlement pipelines as to where are we getting leadership, particularly from governance and so forth. Data collection as it relates to specifically how Black-led organizations are sometimes required and often sometimes struggle with getting data, which takes away from administering the programs that need to happen, and also the fact that there are organizational vulnerabilities that are still and probably even exacerbated in terms of limited cash reserves, because a lot of the organizations have government funding programs that are very program specific as opposed to general operating. And government funding is, while it is one of the areas where that was kind of like a key with most of the organizations, it still, excuse me, had its challenges then. And certainly this kind of gets into why we did the study again, because now after COVID, and IFR is still with us, but that was also an even more important finding as we look at the 2021, 2022 finding. Next slide, please, Mariah. Excuse me. So Dr. Kelly Sloan, and Kelly, just stop me when you think I'm overstepping my area, because I can talk. That's what preachers do. Dr. Kelly Sloan was a principal researcher, incredibly well-renowned and respected in terms of the work that she does. She was both be able to build from what we did with the brand study and kind of informing our reflecting forward work, and is also someone who's continuing to inform us as the findings get out and how that might lead to future research. Our hope is that this is not an endpoint, but again, yet another chapter of the work that we're going to try to do in terms of looking at how Black-led nonprofits do what they do in some challenging times. So in terms of the research design, we looked at the report and findings and looking to see how they changed over time. Of course, from 2016 to now, there were many, many things that changed. Politically, things changed. Certainly the COVID pandemic had a significant impact. So politics, racial unrest, certainly that was key in terms of things that happened. The challenges that faced Black-led human service nonprofits during COVID and the value these organizations contribute to their communities and constituents was very much key, because again, these were organizations that were standing in the gap before, and the gap got wider, and they're still there trying to be doing what they do, but still under-resourced, and like we say before, making bricks without straw, but still needing to make bricks. This is how we do. So looking at the meaning and impact of the current racial justice movements for Black leaders and their organizations were critical, but this time we also, as we did before, wanted to get recommendations for actions from Black leaders, and that speaks a little bit more to why we did more focus groups than survey, because that was a more qualitative approach that really needed to have in terms of getting the type of insight that we needed back from the folks who participated to comprise the report for reflecting forward. In terms of our interview sample, CEOs and executive directors, we have between 1 and 38 years, so we have a very wide expanse. Organizations that were founded, almost 100 years ago into 2019, so we get good diversity there. Average age of the nonprofit organizations that were there, 33 years old, which is a very, very important finding, because we're looking at the average. So we've got folks who are on the younger side of things, that not that the folks who are on the older side of the spectrum don't have value, but it provides a very good snapshot of where things are going based on where things are. There was a very good variance in program services and organizational size and capacity, which again back to the talent of Dr. Sloan in terms of making sure we had a very good representation so that we're not all alike. They had different focus, different founding, different leadership. That was very good. Most lead nonprofits employ between 1, which was a startup, to 250 paid staff, and certainly having organizations of that size. And as Charmaine had mentioned before, being the size of the Urban Affairs Coalition as an example, and its national footprint actually helps us to kind of make sure that we have that diversity along with a nonprofit of 1. So that's interesting to make sure we have that range. Oh, I'm sorry, could you go back one thing, Mariah? I'm sorry, just very quickly, the operating budgets, also 5,000 to 35 million, good range. And last year they have served more than 800,000 Philadelphians. And we think that that's probably a low number because as we count, this is probably underreported. So now we can go, Maria. All right, thank you. So looking at Black leaders interviewed for the study, serving children, youth, and young adults. About half the organization serve infants and young children and seniors. All the leaders interviewed for the study identify as Black, and most lead majority Black serving organizations. That was, again, a very important distinction that we wanted to have, even though we know that other Black and Brown led organizations are also a challenge. We wanted to make sure that we were consistent with where we had our first study into the next one. Some organizational leaders don't consider themselves to be Black led because the board or senior leadership teams are white. So part of that is kind of like their own self-identification. Half the leaders interviewed for the project identify as women, and that's a very important key. We may not get into that today, but I do urge folks to please read that, read the report, because Black women-led organizations have a unique perspective in this work. So we want to look at that. It's like more than half are the first Black executive directors of their respective organizations. Again, critical. And also we're lamenting the fact that here in 2022, we are still looking at the firsts of, so we want to kind of look at that because that perspective is very important. Go ahead, Mariah. So Kelly, should I go into the recommendations? Do you want to?
Yeah, you can go on the recommendations, and when I get to them, I'll just go deeper into it, but that's
Okay.
fine identifying them.
Very good. I do what Kelly says. Since high school, I've done what Kelly Woodland says. It's all good. Go Central. Anyway, so these semi-structured interviews or these nonprofit leaders, each were asked to share their perspective specifically on the pandemic, the increasingly urgent campaigns for racial justice, which we know existed before, but were really amplified and accelerated during the racial unrest that prompted by the murder of George Floyd, and looking at the recommendations for regional funders. That is very, very important as to what we want the regional funding community to know about this and what they need to do. So each leader was explicitly asked, how can regional funders best support the needs of Black nonprofit leaders and Black serving organizations? That comes into our recommendations. Go ahead, Mariah. So I'm going to go through them quickly, and Kelly's going to go more in depth. One is just get to know us. We found that the findings are such that people give money to people that they know. And if the circle of knowledge or circle of familiarity is closed and homogeneous, then trying to get Black-led and Black serving organizations to get that funding, we as a community have to be intentional about how folks get to know what we're doing. The notion of embracing trust-based philanthropy, considering bold, transformational, multi-year gifts that will allow organizations to develop capacity, grow, and thrive. That is all under the rubric of trust-based philanthropy in terms of getting to take what we learned during the pandemic and continuing to do those things, not just because of the pandemic, but because that type of funding is much more needed. And finally, trusting Black leaders. And again, there's a trust factor of looking at Black-led and Black serving organizations and being risky investment, as opposed to trusting that we know what we're doing and we know how to do what we need to do with the resources that are given to us. Next slide. Okay, Dr.
All right, thank you, David. I am going to be very, very brief because that was an excellent overview of the initial report that was done in 2016, and certainly really want to make sure that we're here today for a conversation. We really want to answer questions, but we also want to ask you questions about, how are you feeling? What reflects in your thinking as you look forward around funding Black leaders and Black-led organizations? How does race come into your conversations? How do you really tackle that question? And how do we make sure that we are really making this a movement and not a moment? We know in 2016 we had a really good moment. We have right now an organization called Diverse Force, which is doing a terrific job in working with people of color who want to serve on nonprofit boards. We worked with Bryn Mawr College for those who felt as if they wanted to have some more connecting to information about the sector and how to really become a leader in the sector. But what we really know is that in the end, we are experienced, we are ready, we have been working in this space a long time. We work on some of the toughest issues on the ground in our communities. And we definitely know that even when we don't get all the resources that we should have, we still tackle those problems anyway. So we ask you to really join us, to really examine funding in your organizations and across the sector. And let's get to a place where we absolutely trust Black leaders, where we actually give them the resources that they need, and that we really allow them to define solutions for the issues that they're facing in their communities, and that we will trust them with the funds and the resources that we have to tackle them in effective and in very effective ways. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kelly, who will get into some more specifics around what we found in this report. And then we are here to answer your questions.
Thanks very much, Charmaine, really appreciate that. David, thank you very much for the great overview. Just want to give gratitude again to Dr. Kelly Sloan for her excellent work in structuring the research design so that it builds off the 2016 report. And I just want to emphasize again, and I think David did a good job, this is the continuation of a story being told. All right, so when you read this report, it does not stand alone. It is a continuation of the 2016 report. Thanks to Kate Houston for her continued thought partnership and advocacy to ensure that this report was supported and funded in the manner that it needed to. All right, what I'd like to do first, I'll reintroduce myself. Kelly Woodland, currently Managing Director of Leadership Equity for the United Way. Let me just take a moment just to define what leadership equity is and what it looks like in the nonprofit sector. So leadership equity in the nonprofit sector is evidenced by the existence of a viable pipeline for Black nonprofit professionals to access leadership opportunities. Secondly, Black nonprofit leaders are trusted as experienced and expert partners and thought leaders. Third, Black nonprofit leaders are sufficiently resourced to create and implement strategies that address the needs of their communities. So when I speak about being the Managing Director of Leadership Equity, that is the vision that I'm attempting to pursue, but that is also the information that aligns very closely with the report, and I wanted to mention that. From my background, I've held just about every position one could have in the nonprofit sector. I've led and grown 2 nonprofit organizations. One was a community-based CDC in Point Breeze section of South Philadelphia. The other, an affiliate of a national organization. I've managed pre-college programs, created enrichment programs specifically for Black and Brown young people, worked in philanthropy for over 10 years, and also worked with Black-led nonprofits in doing strategic plans and helping them support their organizations and develop sustainable organizations. Also served on a variety of nonprofit boards. I mention that because I've had not only a 360-degree view on both leadership and access and equity in the sector, but just like David and Charmaine, I've advocated and worked to create access and equity before DEI was a trendy phrase. And I say that because that contextualizes our work. We didn't just wake up this morning and say, oh, equity is important. These are things that myself and other African Americans and people of color have been working on from day one. This report, whereas the 2016 report confirmed disparities in the sector, this report is a call and an appeal for collaborative action. All right. The beauty of this report, and David mentioned the 3 recommendations, the beauty of this report is in its simplicity and the clarity of the recommendations from Black nonprofit leaders. These recommendations are concrete, they're very tangible, and most importantly, they're executable, very doable. Number 1, a very simple request: get to know us. The 2016 branch report pointed to Black leaders having little social capital. Again, that rears itself in this report, meaning that the social and professional networks of Black nonprofit leaders did not and does not include folks with access to funders, gatekeepers, key decision makers, or people with vast influence. And that's a gap that has to be closed. My experience in philanthropy has taught me that funders invest in leaders. Funders won't and they can't invest in leaders they don't know. Why? Because that's a risk. Now, what I'm going to do throughout my talk is to reference certain quotes that are in the report. So when you get the report, whether you download it online or you check it out, you can go to the certain places where I'm identifying. On page 16 of our report, it really supports what we're just saying about the get to know us. Many feel that funders consider them and their organizations risky. Here's a quote: "People give money to who they know, and it's one of the reasons why we see white-led organizations getting more money. It's not that their work is any more important than ours, they have the relationships. When you get to know us, you'll get a chance up close and personal to see the competency, the skills, and the financial acumen required to consistently do more with less. In fact, it appears that some funders, not all, I'm saying some, seem to put Black-led nonprofits in an assigned risk pool." Okay, how can you get to know us? Very practically, host networking opportunities that connect Black leaders with funders. And these don't need to be weighty events or occasions. These are the kinds of things that people do just very casually. Host a networking affair. And in my new role at the United Way, I'd be more than happy to structure or coordinate, schedule any of these types of opportunities for you to get to know these Black leaders. It's not a problem. I'd be happy to assist. Secondly, embrace trust-based philanthropy. Trust-based philanthropy is a method of giving that acknowledges the inherent imbalance of power between the funders and nonprofits. And this approach really appreciates that nonprofit leaders are knowledgeable about their respective community and their needs and are experts whose perspectives should be respected and valued, right? So how can you embrace trust-based philanthropy? We're asking funders to remove the grant restrictions that impede organizational growth and limit the effectiveness by committing to multi-year unrestricted grants. And just as an aside, what allowed many organizations to survive the pandemic was funders lifting restrictions and affording leaders the flexibility to repurpose grants for general operating support. That's one of the best things that came from the pandemic. This community, this philanthropic community, was incredibly responsive and incredibly flexible in allowing nonprofit leaders to do what was needed to support the organizations. We are suggesting that you continue to do that. In fact, on page 24, one of the leaders states, if you give me an operational grant that is going to support a position on the development team, then we can raise money. There are ways to support us and give us flexibility. Now, that quote confirms once again what we've learned from the 2016 report, that Black-led nonprofit organizations were continually asked to do more with less. And that leads me into a complicated issue, to touch on a complicated issue around capacity building. So I need you to, indulge me here and follow me. Historically, funders have invested in what they have called capacity building. And this gets a little tricky, and I think we want to be very careful, because in some, not all, but in some cases, capacity building has been delivered as either a prerequisite for future funding or as a consolation for being declined. And that is typically how Black-led organizations have been dealt with in this case, because the perception is that they are risky. So when they are risky, there are certain things you do for them to either show their mettle or manage them. The tricky part comes into play when capacity building looks like capability building. And capability building oftentimes is predicated on the assumption that Black leaders are lacking the skills to do better. Now, capacity building really is most helpful when you have existing capacity to participate fully in the building part, right? So it may not be impactful if the ED is wearing 35 hats and you're asking him or her to take valuable time 2 days a week or for an entire day to participate in development training to write an effective grant. What may be the best strategy is if those funds are invested in supporting dedicated staff to do the work. Then, if there is an enhancement training, they can participate in that. But asking an organization with limited capacity to participate in capacity building is a struggle. So what is needed is funding to support positions that build organizational capacity. And in some cases, the traditional capacity building sets Black-led organizations up for more of the same, when what is needed was funding to support a position to do more better. And one of the most, just speaking from my personal experience, one of the most impactful grants for my last organization was from the Nelson Foundation, where they didn't just require me to participate in development training, they supported a development position. That allowed my organization to go from, 2 staff people ultimately to 6. When I first joined that organization, it was small, and I knew that it had some limitations, and I took it on because I thought I had the social capital and all the other things that I could leverage to grow it. But what I soon realized was I had to make a choice, whether I needed a development person or whether I needed a fiscal person. And I said, I can do the development work for a year while I get all of the essentials in place. But after that year, it's really going to require the expertise of someone with a deeper skill set. Fortunately, I happened to have conversations with Mindy over at Nelson Foundation, and we were able to get a development person. My organization went from a budget of $700,000 to, when I left, about 1.6. And it's primarily because I had the support of a development person who was both an extremely capable person, but a thought partner. And we had a chance to really do deeper development type of effort and initiatives. And that's an example of building capacity. I think participating, I don't think I could have benefited by participating in a variety of different development workshops. I needed staff to help me do the work. Thirdly, trust Black leaders. We're not incompetent. We do not deserve to be relegated to an assigned risk pool of nonprofit leaders. On page 33 of the report, someone adds, I think at the heart of it is trust. When you're a Black leader, it's like funders are asking, if I give you more money, can I trust you to be responsible? Do you even know what to do with that much money? So these are 3 recommendations that build on each other. If you get to know us, you can alter long-standing grant-making orthodoxies and embrace trust-based philanthropy. If you get to know us, you'll trust Black nonprofit leaders, and grant-making will be more impactful. So what else can you do? We did this report because we know that funders fundamentally want to get it right. We believe these recommendations will help to get it right, because addressing these 3 recommendations, it isn't a kumbaya moment, it's fundamentally good grant making. We're not taking a cynical posture towards philanthropy, because in my experience, and Charmaine and David, we've had the opportunity to meet funders, and we know they want to do the right thing. And what we're saying is we have information and directives that can help you do the right thing, and at the same time meet your goals of making a difference and being impactful in our city and our region. And as I mentioned, fundamentally, it's good grant making. So what I'd like to say is, what you can do right off the bat, read the report, engage your peers and colleagues around it, share it with your boards and your staff, reflect on the grant making practices and explore how they can be challenged and altered. Explore committing to true capacity building. Using the report, engage, members from the Black Nonprofit Chief Executives of Philadelphia. This is an organization that I had a hand in convening when COVID and George Floyd murder occurred. I started, convening Black EDs, and it started off at about 24 people in June 2020. Now we have over 100 members, and we've been meeting monthly. I'd be more than happy to work with you and that group to realize the recommendations in this report. I think that another thing that can be done is working with us to create viable pipelines to diversify philanthropy, staff, and boards. And I'll just say in closing, in my new role at the United Way, I have created an assortment of different efforts and activities. I'd like to sit down with each of you one-on-one or as a group to really discuss how I can bring these things to fruition. So I'm available beyond today to be able to do that, but I'd like to open it up to questions. Thank you for your time.
And feel free to put your question in the chat or just come off mute and ask it.
What do we do in school if we don't get any questions? We can call on people.
I have a question. My name is Janet Kroll. I'm Executive Director of the Homeless Assistance Fund, and I want to say hello and acknowledge Charmaine Matlock-Turner, who was instrumental in our founding and continues to be really an important leader with Hafi and supporter.
Thanks,
So,
Janet.
Thank you, Charmaine. So one of the things, Hafi is among probably the smaller funders at this gathering, but one of the conversations, I work with a panel to do our grant making, and one of the really interesting conversations we had this year as we were seeking to support organizations that were Black-led and/or we're using racial equity and intersectionality as organizational drivers, as evidenced by, things around board and leadership and recruitment and how they arrayed services, is we were talking about capacity. How do we define organizational capacity? And what I came to understand, having spent 15 years at the Pew Charitable Trust, which I loved, but the way that I defined organizational capacity had a real bias toward white-led groups. And that was part of my own biases and my own assumptions. And so we had really good conversation about how do we think about organizational capacity and the ways in which connection to community and representation are essential parts of capacity. And so I wonder if you can any of you can speak about that and thinking about organizational power and capacity differently that will lead us to different grant-making decisions. Hope that makes sense.
Janet, yeah, I definitely think it makes sense. As you know, at the coalition, we are a home for nonprofits, and we work with community organizations that are either established and are looking to grow, as well as those that we call seed stage that are getting started. And I remember, going to some funders to say, we really are going to sort of like beef up our seed stage initiative because we really love the fact that, people in communities want to solve their own problems. And funders would say to me almost automatically, aren't they duplicating services? Aren't they, aren't there people like already sort of like doing that? Why would someone want to do that? And I said, well, I never hear that conversation when we talk about building small business. No one sort of says, wow, I don't like the fact that Federal Donuts is here because we already have Saxby's. So why do we need another coffee shop? What we say is, well, we think that the market is competitive, that people should have an opportunity to grow something and see whether or not the market responds. And the same thing is true when you think of nonprofits. People in communities have a slightly different way of maybe looking at the problem. They have a slightly different way of maybe really sort of tackling a particular issue. And so we don't usually take the time to sort of listen to say, okay, tell me a little bit about your idea and why. Is there a particular population that you're interested in? Do you feel as if you need to be competitive with someone else, that you don't think that they're sort of meeting those needs? I mean, we should see folks who want to do social enterprise as important to the fabric of our city and our community as people who want to start a commercial enterprise. I'd like to ask a question. Maybe it might spark some conversation. As you sort of take a look at within your own organizations of, thinking about and looking at Black-led nonprofits, did any of these findings surprise you, or did any of them like really resonate with you? Was there anything that sort of resonated or surprised you as you've sort of heard about this report, whether you've read the whole thing or just sort of have heard our recommendations?
I'll speak to that.
Hi, Francis.
Hi, Charmaine. Hello, Kelly. It reminded me a little bit of, first of all, I loved how very focused it was, very clear, 1, 2, 3. This is what needs to happen. It struck me as being very much like, everything you learned that was of value you learned in kindergarten. I mean, get to know people, trust people, invest in people. And it's the basics and yeah, it's the basics. That's what struck me.
Thank you.
It's not rocket science. It's not super complicated. It's
Right. And that's what we really felt, that, you know, this was really very clear. Anyone would be able to share those three recommendations with their board or with their organization or with their staff. Yet we think that they are powerful. They are simple yet powerful. And when you can combine those two things together, we think that you have a chance to really have an impact here. So I'm just curious, you know, if you were to say, okay, we want to adopt these in our organization or within organizations in the sector, you know, where do you think some of the barriers are in order to get folks to say, yeah, we definitely need to do something about these three issues?
I think the notion of risk is given too much space in philanthropy. We see that both in grant making and we see it in sometimes a hesitance to do mission aligned investing. And one of the things that we've been talking about at HAFI in both instances is there is this fear of the unknown being too risky. But, you know, if the economy tanks and we lose, the endowment loses value on our beautiful blue chip investments, we just say, well, the markets are, you know, that's just the markets. And so I think philanthropy really needs to, or we need to rethink how we think about risk, because often, you know, the risk of investing in an organization that is not effective, that is not connected to community, is actually higher than the risk of investing in an organization that we don't know well, but could take the time to know.
Thank you. Anyone else?
so I
Has
would
anybody,
just,
I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
I just was going to say, adding on to what Janet said, I think that historically, I like to think things are changing, but I'm not so sure. But I think historically, there's always a reason why you can't fund an organization that's Black-led, or where there's a personal issue, or suddenly it's either they're not sustainable, or they're not, or it's too risky, or what was the reason you were talking about earlier, Kelly? Capacity. Do they really have the capacity?
Right.
No,
do they
you
know
said,
what they're
Charmaine,
doing? Yeah.
do they know what they're doing? Or as you
Right.
said, Charmaine, you know, somebody else is already doing that and it's a duplication. And I think that as staff, I think for those of us who are trying to move on this, there needs to be a pushing back. There needs to be, but that's hard. So how do you say, you know, because I've been part of these conversations where someone will say, oh, they don't have the capability. When you talk about somebody leading an organization, a person of color, and they'll say, oh, I don't think they have that ability. And you're like, well, everything I know about this person says that they're absolutely prepared. So, but they can't articulate why they're not. And you think you know it's why the reason is. And yet if you say, well, you know, I wonder if you'd feel differently if the person was white, then it's back to the basic conversation that I think a lot of us are struggling with right now.
Right. I think one of the areas that many people, at least we encourage people to start with, which is take a look at your own data. You'll say to us, Charmaine, give me your data. So I'm saying to you, give me your data. I think one of the first things that you can do is count. Go in, take a look at the grants that you did over the last, 3 to 5 years, and how are you doing in just being able to effectively measure whether or not you're contributing and supporting Black leaders and or Black-led nonprofits. It doesn't mean that you have to automatically draw a conclusion, but as we know, if we don't the old saying, right? It doesn't count if you don't measure it, right? And so we really do and should know within our philanthropic community, what are we doing? You know, how well are we doing supporting Black-led organizations? I mean, Kelly did a terrific job in saying, let's make sure that we are engaging those Black leaders. The work that he did while at the same time, while he was trying to get funding and hire people and get more money for his organization, he was out along with myself and David talking to other nonprofit leaders so that when people say, okay, tell us who these people are, tell us, you know, what they're doing. We right now have 100 people that you can talk to, that you can get to know, that you can understand, and they are highly prepared, they're smart, they are doing terrific work. And I can point to also within the coalition, you know, 80 community-based organizations, many of them led by people of color, not all of them, but that are doing tremendous work in communities and really making things happen. I mean, I wonder whether or not, I don't know if any of you know the organization One Day at a Time, founded by the Reverend Henry Wells. I was in the office of State Senator Roxanne Jones when he first came and said, I am just concerned about people who are drug addicted. And I've got like 5 people in my house, Charmaine and Senator Jones, and I'm trying to figure out how can I do something about this problem. He's someone who had been formerly incarcerated, had drug and alcohol problems himself. And we said, wow, look at the passion, look at the interest. We went to a couple community meetings. We saw the impact that he had. And the beauty is that as what happens with a lot of Black-led nonprofits, we were able to get some government funding for him to be able to ultimately get started. We weren't sure whether or not any foundation would help him ultimately do this work. The Hope organization did. He ended up expanding this program in other countries. And he also used the UAC business platform to help manage the business side of things. And that's not because he couldn't manage it. It was because it was a smart, effective, cost-effective way in order to do that. Today, the organization is now led by his son, who I was able to get to think about how he wanted to continue his father's work. He ended up going to Pierce College, getting a 2-year degree, and has done just a tremendous job in keeping this terrific organization going. They now do HIV/AIDS housing, all kinds of programs and services. But if you had met Reverend Wells and looked at the traditional profile of him over 30 years ago, you might have said, too risky, not educated in the same way that we are, not as well prepared, but yet has saved the lives of thousands and thousands of people in the city of Philadelphia over their tenure.
I would also like to add, I think as we look at Black-led organizations, I think what has to be considered or factored into the calculus, and this sounds warm and fuzzy and people can't quantify it, but it is valuable. And that is the value of cultural competency and lived experiences in shaping the work that's being delivered. Oftentimes, when you look at the folks who are the beneficiary of social services, they're Black and brown. Why can't the people who look like the folks being served not only be at the table, but be part of creating the interventions and the strategies and part of the implementation? There is value to be had in the lived experiences and cultural competency. I'm not saying that alone, but I'm saying that in tandem, in combination with the leadership skills, the fiscal acumen, the development ability, the administrative capacity, and so forth, all of those matter. When you get to know Black leaders, you will see a wide variety. And as Charmaine mentioned, even when you get to meet the younger Black leaders, there has been an evolution in the type of leaders that we're seeing. It would surprise you, and that's why it's important to get to know who these individuals are. Get to know how they think, how they unpack problems, also how they approach things. But you'll also see that there's a degree of credibility that they have in the communities that they represent that can't be replaced or substituted.
Kelly, I have a question, and forgive me for.
Go on.
So how do you push back when people who are actually making the decisions believe that change is not going to happen in a particular area? I don't care how much money you put into that area, geographical area.
Well, you know, I think information, but also the fact that change takes a long time. And if it hasn't worked with the way they've been doing it, then there is a need to potentially change in what's being done. I think the continual information has to be done. I think bringing in, and I know it sounds, again, warm and fuzzy, a little too practical, bringing people into the actual office space, the people who you're trying to fund, bringing them into meetings when you're having these conversations with the board around certain issues, understanding the complexity of creating an intervention and what's needed on the ground to implement a quality program or service or intervention. Unpacking the problems with those very people who are actually doing the work. Oftentimes in philanthropy, we collaborate and we have a lot of great enriching meetings with our staff, but we may not bring people who have been doing the work into the conversation to talk about what happens when the rubber hits the road. I'm not sure that that gets to your question, because it is a complicated thing, but I would say it's continual information. It's engaging the folks and bringing them into your space to discuss how things can be done. It is taking risk, making grants, but making grants that fit the dimension of the task that you're asking these folks to address. Because making a small grant to an organization, you really have to right-size your expectations. And I think in some cases, funders have to have very realistic expectation as to what can be done and how far and how impactful an organization can be. So
Right. And I think let me just add to that. The other point that I think is important for us to remember is that some of the issues that we're dealing with clearly are systemic. You know, racism is a systemic issue. The fact that we're still paying people less, that we are still, we just had a big redlining case, as you probably saw in the paper, where people were being denied mortgages. There are still systemic issues, but we can't wait for all of those issues to be resolved by laws and governments and courts. We still have the responsibility to try to help those and try to support those who ultimately find themselves victims of a system that is not fair. And so what I have said to funders is, you know, we have plenty of people. I could point to the thousands of young people that we helped through the Summer Youth Employment Program and were able to move on. But if you put another 1,000 young people into poverty because we haven't done policies effectively, we haven't changed those areas that ultimately are driving people into poverty or driving people into drug and alcohol abuse or other kinds of challenges, or underfunding education. So we end up with people who are not able and ready to do the things that they really, really want to do. We have a responsibility to work on both sides, to work on the policy side, to try to get as much permanent change as possible, which is some of the hardest work. At the same time, you don't look at someone who is hungry and say, okay, let me see whether or not I can do something about the agriculture policy. You try to feed them, you try to help them, and at the same time, try to make sure that you're working on the policy front and supporting those who are trying to drive systemic change.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to call out, we only have a minute left. So fortunately, it sounds like this is a conversation that needs to continue. And Kelly, I know you've generously offered to have that conversation with people and keep it going. But I'd like to hear from you, if there's both of you and Kelly and Charmaine, if there's any final reflections you have for the group. Especially, it seems like, this is a group in agreement. This is common sense. This is what people have been doing, need to keep doing. But kind of even if you agree with this, what's the gut check here? What do you want funders to leave this session with?
I want them to be engaged. I want them to tell others. I want them to say that we're going to do this. I want this to be a movement, not a moment, not a publication of a report that sits online or sits somewhere else. I want it to sit in your heart, and I want it to sit in your mind. And I want this to be a movement, which was why it was critical, which is why we're so excited that the United Way reached out to Kelly to say, how do we make sure that we are staffing this? That was a struggle we had with the last report, trying to find the staffing structure in order to keep the energy around it. We have staffing, he has some funding. Now the question is, are you ready to go along and really make this a movement for equitable funding for Black leaders and for Black-led organizations? So thank you all so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And everybody knows you could talk to me offline as well. And Kelly is going to be on the front line with you. And like I said, we have 100 leaders that are already out there that you can get to know.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, David.
Okay.
Thank you